Yeah. Okay.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for that. Okay, everybody, welcome. Thanks again for making the time. I think we should probably just introduce ourselves. So I'm going to hand over to Daire to introduce themselves.
Yeah, fab. Thanks, Jane. Thanks, everybody, for joining. My name is Daire Dempsey. I am the policy officer for an organisation called TENI. We're the Transgender Equality Network Ireland. So we're the national trans advocacy organisation here in Ireland. And I guess just to introduce the organisation a little bit, we have a few kind of different areas of work that we look at. We do quite a lot of work within the education space, which is what brings us here today, looking at kind of trying to create more inclusive education spaces, kind of all the way from, primary school up through kind of adult education, universities, colleges, further ed, all that kind of stuff. And that would be kind of looking at a whole bunch of different areas around how we can create inclusive spaces, which obviously we'll talk about as part of the conversation. We also do lots of training and support around healthcare and trying to make healthcare spaces more inclusive for trans people, around kind of legislation and kind of our equality work and advocacy around political gains, I guess. And then the really key part of our work, which also might be relevant in this conversation, is around support. So we have support groups that we either directly facilitate or that we kind of link in with all around Ireland for trans young people, for trans adults, and then also for parents and family members as well. And we think it's really important that people are able to kind of link in with people who are in their communities, whatever their community might be, and to kind of get support around that. So we have a lot of family support, and if that is something that is of kind of relevant to anybody on the call or listening on the recording, there's loads of information about that on our website. It's just teni.ie. But yeah, this is a little introduction to the organisation. And as I said, I am the policy officer, but before I was in this role, I was the education officer for TENI, which kind of brings me into this conversation. And I should say my pronouns are they, them, and I am non-binary. Yeah, is enough?
Yeah, perfect. Thanks very much, Daire.
Okay.
And hi, everyone. I'm Jane O'Kelly. I work in GCU in the Institute of Education in Drumcondra, primarily in the area of further education and training. And my heart lies in adult and community education, and certainly in QQI levels 1 to 4, our non-levels, unaccredited, non-formal, informal education and lifelong learning. But I am the chair of a programme that provides initial teacher education for further education and training tutors in Ireland. But very interested in this space. I know a number of trans people, and we are very conscious of the conversation that's going out in the world and the discourse that is visible in the media, generally really around minorities, around rights, around people's lives. So this is where we thought this conversation would fit into an EPALE community event, and we will continue the conversation going forward. So welcome to everyone, and please feel free to put a question in the chat and we'll keep an eye on that. And also we'll finish the recording in about 35 minutes, 40 minutes, and open it up for discussion. So thanks again. So when we were thinking about this enormous subject, which in itself can be a very small subject, depending on your viewpoint, are a very understandable and inclusive part of all of our lives experienced together, we kind of just broke it down into 3 areas. So the first being the learner experience, in adult ed, community ed, and otherwise. Then the tutor experience as educators and people working with others who are trying to develop their own potential. How do we support that? And then that wider conversation, because I think we do need to acknowledge the wider conversation that is happening and different viewpoints in this area. So about 10, 15 minutes, depending on time for each of those. And we'll see how we go. But this is a very organic kind of broad space. So, Daire, I'm going to ask you in terms of the TENI viewpoint and your viewpoint as well about the learner experience of transgender non-binary people. Are they asking for things to change or things to happen within the education space, and what are they asking for?
Yeah, I think when we look at, I think there's been a real, a kind of a growing understanding, I think, in the last maybe number of years or decades around what is encapsulated, I guess, within the learning space, for students, for learners, and also for educators, I think as well. But focusing on the learners at the moment, I think, and I think there's been a kind of growing understanding around what people bring with them into the space and what the needs might be kind of within that space, and taking kind of maybe more of a holistic approach to how people learn, different kinds of learning styles, different kinds of needs within the space, all that sort of stuff. Kind of coming from maybe a much more sort of rigid, or maybe more kind of prescriptive approach around like the kind of reading, writing, arithmetic sort of practices, or maybe of the past. And so I think and that's kind of where we base a lot of our work. And we've done, a number of pieces of research, or supported pieces of research around the experiences of trans and gender diverse learners within the education system, anywhere from kind of primary, post-primary, and then in adult education too. And what we're seeing within that, I think, is a real need. There's a number of things that come out of that. There's a real need, I think, for students to feel, it's not groundbreaking, but to feel respected and heard, and that they are able to bring their full selves, I guess, into the space, into the school, into the learning environment, into the classroom, whatever it might be, the lecture hall, and to feel that they're able to be themselves authentically without worrying about how others are going to see them, or how their lecturers or educators or teachers are going to see them, and what that might impact, how that might impact on them. And I think there's a really interesting balance within the learning space between, we're there to learn, and like our educators are there to deliver the learning, and that is kind of the bounds of the relationship. But then also we're in a kind of collaborative space together, and people would hopefully feel able to like share and bring themselves to that space. And I think what that means for trans and gender diverse students is, there's really kind of specific needs, I guess, around, if you have students who maybe are using a different name than what might be their legal name, or using a different name than what's on maybe the roll, or their kind of student records. We also are seeing this around, we need to have a conversation about pronouns, and making sure that everybody in the space is referring to each other in the way that they want to be referred. So using the right kinds of names, using the right pronouns, using the right language. And I think that's been something that students have been bringing up with their peers and with their lecturers, and equally less so, but equally also for if you have trans educators and lecturers, to bring that up with their students and everybody else in the room, and just making sure that we're creating kind of a culture of respect around that. So that's something I think that is there in terms of, I guess, that kind of specific sort of interaction within the classroom and within the learning space. And what we're seeing overwhelmingly in the research is that when students don't feel respected within a space, whether that's on the basis of their gender, or on the basis of maybe their race or ethnicity, their religion, like whatever it might be, it's very likely to kind of cause a student to withdraw, or to not feel safe and secure within the space, and to not be able to really fully show up for their learning, and to engage fully in the learning environment. And so that, I think there's a really important piece there around making sure that we're getting that kind of interpersonal interaction right with each other, and that we're all treating each other with the dignity and respect that we need. And that's really one of the big things I think that's coming out of the research. And then the other things, I guess, are kind of around looking at, and this is slightly more nuanced conversation, and it kind of depends on the topic, but looking at like the teaching materials, and what's happening in the curriculum in various different areas, and how inclusive it might be, and how maybe we can build more inclusion into like the actual curriculum and the actual teaching content, and into the language that's being used, all that kind of stuff. And that would kind of be very dependent on the area. There's probably not, I don't know. I'm thinking of areas, I guess, that maybe it's less relevant for, but then areas where it is relevant, and we would see that a lot around the kind of humanities and like history, but even stuff like biology, that kind of stuff too. Making sure that we're using language that, I guess, that is inclusive, or even where where we're using language that's maybe more historical, but just naming that as well. And I think that can be true for, as I said, for gender, but then also for like all other types of identities and communities as well. So there's a really interesting piece in there for me around building more inclusive curricula for everybody, and kind of trying to tap into some of those approaches around kind of universal inclusion and stuff as well. So anyway, those are the two, I think, the two things I think that come up the most.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much for explaining all that. Yeah, I think you've brought up a lot of different things, which we won't manage in 10 minutes, but certainly in terms of the education point of view and what we've seen in the changing discourse in educational theory is this focus on inclusion and on wider kind of psychosocial aspects of a sense of belonging. And also, even with the basic theories, Maslow's hierarchy of needs around feeling safe and secure within your learning environment so you're able to learn. And I think we've seen that replicated right across the 20th century with other theories, as well as social learning theory, which relies on the fact that we're all working together. Thanks, Florence,
Right.
and thanks for coming. There's also other aspects of inclusive theory that comes into play. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought there for a minute. And what's coming out strongly for me is the kind of hidden curriculum that can exist behind learning environments. So, you know, we may have a shared vision as educators around this inclusive space. Oh, yeah, people like Knowles, Malcolm Knowles, in terms of andragogy and adults, that you're bringing your whole self, your experience and your aspirations and your ambitions into the room, into that learning environment. The fact that you're there is a wonderful thing. And whoever you are, that person is entitled to that experience within the learning space. And the same for Jack Mesro as well, in terms of transformative learning for people in the room that come in and they're challenged and they learn about others. They learn to critically think and examine and see other points of view. And it's absolutely critical to the running of a learning environment and in education, but also to a society in terms of the society we're living in, which you could say is a kind of a functional society that has a shared set of values. So we're meant to be working to a certain extent from this value consensus. And I think we see all of the theory and educational viewpoint and the learners and transgender people themselves wanting the same thing. And yet there are challenges for us to deliver that. And in part, I think that that kind of idea, the hidden curriculum that's often applied to formal education sits behind the scenes. And also there's aspects of personal and professional identity for everyone, which I think we'll come to in the next little bit. But certainly in terms of in the learning environment itself, it seems like kind of a horrible American no-brainer that everyone in the space should be welcome and respected, no matter who they are. And the focus on inclusion and active inclusion in adult education as well, to specifically look at people who and minorities and others who are not getting the benefits of the learning environment or education in the same way that others are. So it's surprising. I mean, I'd ask you, our members of TENI and the community, they are overwhelming in the research. Are there many that are having a good positive experience in education as well as others? Is there a balance or a ratio there?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, I probably couldn't quote as to the ratio or the statistics or anything off the top of my head, but I think definitely, I mean, I think, what we're seeing in TENI is, we have a huge amount of demand, like of educators, schools, teachers, etc., coming to us, looking for support and saying, maybe off the back of someone in the school has come out as trans, or within the space has come out as trans, or one of the students has, or one of the staff members has, more usually the students, or maybe they just are being proactive about it, but they would come to us looking for support, looking for guidance, looking for information, looking for training, looking for policy support, all that kind of work, and we get a huge amount of that coming to us. And I know that there are like so many other LGBT organizations doing wonderful work within this space, like obviously Belong To, with a huge focus on the secondary schools, Shout Out as well, doing workshops like that. And I think there's even the fact that we're all so busy is such a wonderful testament to how, I think, receptive so many education spaces are, and how many people working within that space really want to do right by their students and by their colleagues, and I think I think you'd probably be hard pressed to find any school and at any level that doesn't have trans people within it now, and I think the fact that people are feeling more able to come out within the space, and that might be the catalyst that pushes a school or a college or whatever to say, oh my God, okay, well, we have to get our ducks in a row here, and how can we support you? But even the fact that people are beginning to feel able to have those conversations, I think is so heartwarming, and it's so hopeful for the future. And you mentioned earlier around some of the sort of social discourse around gender and around transness and all those pieces. And I think it's easy to look at that and to feel, so overwhelmed with, there's so much negativity. But what we're seeing on the ground is, really, really welcoming space from schools, really, really welcoming spaces from students, to the work that we're doing. And I think it's really wonderful. So there definitely have been really positive steps made in the last number of years, and kind of small incremental things, that happen slowly, and they don't make the news, and it doesn't become news that like such and such a school has adopted, a better policy, or such and such a school has done, XYZ fundraiser, or they've opened an LGBT club, or whatever they've done, that doesn't make the news. And I think sometimes we lose the good pieces from it. So my view on it definitely is that I think the vast majority of people in Ireland are, they want to do right by each other. And maybe they just need a little bit of guidance, a little bit of information around like what that means. And so like if you are a teacher or an educator, you have someone in your class who comes out as trans, you just might not know about what the support needs are going to be there, or what the right language is to use there, or like how to have the conversation about pronouns in a way that's safe, or how to intervene if someone else is making a comment that's not very kind, or if there's any kind of bullying going on, like how do you approach that? And I think it's been really useful for us to be able to give that information, those resources, and those tools to people working within the space. I think it's definitely when you look at the landscape, I guess, of Irish education, I do feel like a lot of places are becoming more inclusive and have that as a very specific value, in a way that I think we sometimes overlook that, I guess.
Absolutely. And I think it very interesting points there, because in the whole area of inclusion, and what we're trying to do around our practice and around our policies and everything, is to include everyone within that space. And of course, trans people are not just trans, they could be a person of color, they could have a different sexual orientation, they could be a different ethnicity, and they could be a wheelchair user. There's, the intersectionality of people, and who we are and how we present in the learning environment is covered by this idea of inclusion, that everyone is welcomed into the space. And really, there are certain areas of people's lives that should not be needing to be addressed in the space unless if the space is truly inclusive, that everyone was welcomed and the conversations are happening. That one would hope for in the future. But I think you raised interesting issues there, and I think part of it as well is around people's experience of trans people. Because I have to say, I know possibly 3 LGBTQ people in my life, and I know 2 trans people, and I only know them in the last 5 years. So up to that point, now I know one more. So in that space, it can be challenging. You can be fearful. You can be fearful of causing offense. You can be fearful of difference, and that's something where you don't really know how to behave. And I think that does translate into the learning environment as well, across all kinds of areas, including anti-racism and other parts where we just don't say anything, in the hope that perhaps the problem will go away or someone will stay quiet, and we can lose people. We can lose our students and learners because they just stop coming, because they don't have that sense of belonging at the very basic level within a learning environment. So that tutor experience again, back to the kind of the learning environment, and then I suppose for me what's interesting is that personal and professional identity, because I think Hamacek said, you are who you teach, and you teach who you are. So it can be difficult sometimes as an educator to separate the personal and the professional viewpoints. And yet we're in the learning environment, we're doing a job, and the job, although in adult and community ed and in many educational areas, is much more of a vocation or a passion or an ethos and a set of values. And I think it has to be. Sometimes they can be in conflict, and sometimes they're in conflict because of that ignorance and that lack of awareness or understanding of other people's positions. So In terms of the tutor experience, I mean, I just picked up some of the things you were saying there about perhaps we're also within systems that registry or registration takes in the name of the person that's coming in. And yet, you know, my given name is Lucy, right? I don't use it. I don't feel like a Lucy. So I've never used it, but it keeps coming up every now and again on official documentation. So small things like maybe creating a class list that reflects people's names, what they want to be called. Very small little steps like that can make a difference.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, you know, I've had a few conversations, and I've been very lucky to have conversations with people, you know, about this across like different kinds of sectors, different kinds of spaces. And what we're seeing is like, you know, maybe trans people have names that they use that they don't like using, or, you know, whatever, they might use a different name than what's on their official documents or whatever. Similarly, like maybe someone like you who just like doesn't really like whatever your given name is. We also see this a lot for students, maybe like international students, or you know, people who have like recently moved here or whatever, who might choose a different name, or who might not, you know, totally fine whatever way. But you know, and I think this, and again, also again, this, I think this piece around like when we mispronounce someone's name, even like, and I know I personally feel like such a deep like, oh God, and a fear and a worry about saying the wrong thing around that piece. And it takes real bravery to be able to accept and someone, for someone to say like, oh, actually it's, you know, this or that or whatever, and to own up and say like, yeah, thank you, like, and I appreciate you correcting me on that. So I think sometimes for me it's about like sort of tapping into like some of those conversations around like maybe actually a lot of us could benefit from this, and a lot of us could benefit from having a like, again, getting into like kind of on the granular level, but like so many of the conversations are like, well, you know, the database is this, you know, and we only have these fields in our forms. We only have like first name, surname. We don't have a field for known as, or we don't have a field for preferred, or, you know, and then we don't have the ability to change that once that data is in there. So I think it's really interesting to me how many of our decisions and how we move around in the day to day is formulated around like what the computer says, or like what's on this form.
Yeah, welcome to FET.
I've done this work within FET, and I've had these conversations within the ETBs as well. You know, and that's within that, but I extrapolated out to like the birth certificate process and how we have to write down a gender at that point, and how much that impacts all of us as we go on. You know, so it's funny to me that all of the systems that we built up around us that actually don't maybe fit loads of us in loads of different ways. So yeah, I think there's a good piece there and around just trying to feel more able to have those conversations. And I really resonated with what you were saying there around people having like a fear and a worry about saying the wrong thing and doing the wrong thing. And what I find, because I deliver a lot of training sessions, and we all do in Tenny, you know, we all deliver a lot of training sessions, and we always try to deliver them, you know, like face to face, either on Zoom or in person, but not, you know, kind of on an online learning or in a video or whatever, because what I find is the most valuable piece within those conversations is just trying to break down some of that fear. And people are coming to it usually from such a place of good faith and such a place of worry. And they have so much anxiety about, I'm going to say the wrong thing, I'm going to use the wrong name, I'm going to use the wrong pronoun, I'm going to offend somebody, I'm going to upset somebody. And it's such a wonderful you know, intention to have is to not say the wrong thing. But sometimes I think that fear and that anxiety blows it out of proportion, and you get too scared to say anything at all, and you just don't say anything. And so I think what is really valuable within those sessions is, for me anyway, to go there and to say like, hey, hi, let's breathe it out. Like, let's just let some of that go. I'm going to show you some of the right language to use. And over the next 90 minutes, I'm going to model the right language. And we're going to talk through some of this. And if the only thing that comes out of this session is that, now you know you have met a trans person, because that's also really useful. And maybe you have used the word transgender in a sentence and not felt like it was like a curse word. That's the most important piece that we can do in that first session. And I think that's some of the really valuable work that we do with people, is to just show up and be able to facilitate that conversation. And I think as well as educators, and you know, speaking about me, like as an educator in this area who is also trans, being able to go there into a space and to be able to have a facilitated space for people to ask the questions that they need to ask, maybe in a way that is safe and comfortable. They're not asking me as an individual trans person, they're asking me as an educator, and I'm able to advocate from that space and not from a space of like my personal relationships with this person or that person or this family member or whatever it might be. And I find that's really, really useful, and it allows the learners in the space, who are often educators themselves, it gives them a space to work through some of whatever they need to work through, or to, get it right in their head, whatever way that is. So I can't. The question's gone. I've tangented off, but I think it's yeah. But I think working through some of that fear is really some of the most important work that we do around it. And I think, oh yeah, and coming back to the just trying to make sure that our teachers and educators and our tutors are more comfortable and less scared. And even if you get it wrong, like, that's fine. We all make mistakes all the time. And that's probably my number two biggest piece of learning is like, if you make a mistake with someone's name, like, that's okay. Like, we all do it. I mispronounce people's name. My name is Dara and it has a weird spelling. People mispronounce my name all the time. And I'm just going to correct them on it. And like, it's fine. And sometimes it might not be fine, right? Like, so sometimes you might make a mistake with someone's name or someone's pronoun and they might get upset with you about it. And that might be about you, but it also might be about like everything else that's going on in their life right now, and just being able to like hold some space for that as well. And so I think that's the big piece that comes in for me is if we can help all of us and each other, but specifically, I guess, within this space, our educators and our tutors to feel more comfortable with not always getting it right, but doing their best anyway. That's the most important piece for me. Because you don't need to, I don't think you need to like fully grasp how the intricate ways that people experience their genders or whatever, because I don't think any of us can do that for any of us anyway, and we all walk into a space with totally different experiences. And it's not about understanding. It's not about, for me, understanding like exactly, Jane, who you are as a person and exactly what your personal history has been. It's just about me saying like, okay, cool, your name is Jane. I'm going to call you that. Your pronoun is this, that's fine. I often liken it when I'm in sessions with like, with being a parent, right? Like, I'm not a parent. I don't understand what it means to be a parent. I can't, but I'm not going to deny anybody else's experiences of parenthood, So I think it's just about that. And again, and you were saying around like building more inclusion in around gender and around, sexuality or sexual orientation and around like race and background and religion, all that kind of stuff. Like, we don't need to understand what is happening for all those people. We just need to be able to like respect each other and use the right kinds of words and the right kind of language.
Absolutely. It's a very simple concept, but it's a very powerful one to see it happening and to see it happening consistently, which would be many of ours wish. Just there's an awful lot in that there. I'm just thinking about it. In terms, sometimes I think, and we're wandering into 2:05, so don't worry, we're going to stop talking shortly, guys, and open up the floor. But I think, in terms of the learning environment itself, Tenny has some wonderful documentation. There's one around the workplace, and there's other guides, and of course they're available to come and talk. But that ability to just talk to the person, or to find out what people want, or to look also to see what little things like the names and the pronouns, and just to give it a go. If you get it wrong, you try again the next time. It's very, very important and very helpful. One of the things I saw in the documentation, which was good for me because I am guilty of doing this as an educator, is asking the person in the room who I don't understand to kind of train me in on who they are, right, and how to react to that, because I actually don't know who to ask, right? So you kind of end up nearly interrogating the person about their life and their lived experience so you can understand it. Totally wrong place, totally wrong space, kind of thing. But I think it's a human experience to try and understand. And I know we do it a lot in Ireland as well. And that's something that kind of stopped me in my tracks. About, oh yeah, this person doesn't have to train me in on what it's like to be a trans person. I can educate myself separately, or I can chat in a normal course of events with a person, this person about life, and it'll come up naturally and organically.
And maybe hopefully. What's also relevant to think about there as well is, your specific relationship in that context, and maybe if there's a power imbalance there, or like, any of that kind of stuff, it kind of can preclude. And I think I was trying to get at that earlier around what I was saying about, for me entering a space in a professional kind of way, and as like an educator and an advocate in my professional job, it feels, for me, doing that feels like, if I go, say, and I have had the experience of going back to, where I went to university, for example, to give training sessions there, right? And it feels completely different to enter in that way and to give the training session and to have the conversation and facilitate the discussion, all that kind of stuff, than it felt for me to attend there as a student and try and advocate for myself as a student with my lecturers. Felt way more vulnerable to do that than to go in as a professional and say, like, I'm here for the conversation, and to hold that space around, like, and if you need to ask me something that maybe is not super appropriate, we're going to be able to have a conversation about why that's not super appropriate without me feeling like I need to personally advocate for myself and my rights within this space. It's a completely different feeling, and I feel very lucky to be able to do that. And we would get a lot of the time when we get invited in to do a training, the query might have come from a staff member in a space, but it also might have come from students, right? And we've had it within FED, and we've had it within the ETVs, where students have requested, can you come in and deliver a talk? Because they don't want to have to do this with their lecturers. And I think that's completely right. And I think it's completely fair to say, hey, there's someone who knows how to do this, and crucially is being paid to do this, and they can come and deliver this in a way that is less personal, and is a better, maybe going to be slightly more facilitated space. So I think there's that bit too, but then it's also like, we also need to be able to talk to each other as people, right? And we need to be able to have conversations as people. And I think it's really, really fine if you're with somebody and they're using language that you don't understand, or they're saying, whatever they're saying about it, and to be like, oh, cool, like, can you explain that to me? Or like, what does that mean for you? Or whatever, but always in a way that, that they don't have to if they don't want to, I guess. There is an out kind of from that conversation as needed, because sometimes you just get tired of explaining yourself all the time.
Well, yeah, I'd imagine so. And it is, there's a lot going on out there in education for everybody, and for young people and young adults, and adults as well, in terms of the wider world. So just see that neat segue into the wider challenges. But it's very much impactful on people's lives, the discourse that's out there, social media, the kind of things we're seeing on the news every day, and kind of conflation of issues coming together for people in a moment, and the frustration that comes from that. And sometimes, potentially as educators, you're juggling a huge amount of things going on in the room. So you're looking at inclusion, you're looking at promoting diversity, representation of imagery in the curriculum, of language, of written texts. Otherwise, I mean, even in a tangential way, like in terms of ESOL for Ukrainian people, our refugees, the materials we have aren't fit for purpose. Potentially they're made for other target groups, other learners, rather than people coming through, and it takes time to develop these things. So I do think it's kind of it's cheering to see the change in terms of media, even on the television, in the materials that we use in our educational space, that represents more diversity. But the inclusion in the room and in the learning environment is again, people in their lives, bringing their lives into that space. And we try to meet each other as equals, and be respectful of each other's experiences. But I imagine frustrations boil over, and also educators are trying to think of inclusion, differentiation, active inclusion, supporting others, using the right terms, using the right, and that's what we're paid for, Dara, I know. But outside of the school and outside of the education setting, you're then living your personal life, and those different views, different philosophies, different ethos, and different exposure to different conversations come in with the person into the room as well. And then, of course, trans people are living in that world on a regular basis, where this discourse is up and down, and they're kind of positioned. I use that term, weaponized, in some ways as well, in a conversation that isn't about them. It's about something else entirely. And sometimes it is about the changing nature of gender identity and expression for people that are coming from a different kind of generation or a different viewpoint. So I'm just conscious of the need for more conversations of people to people. I think it's what we do best, and to hear from the horse's mouth, basically, about a person's experience, and also the small steps that can help us be more inclusive together. But I appreciate that it's a difficult time at the moment.
Yeah.
Would you say?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Yeah, it is. I think it is. I think, not to be too morbid about it, but I think
Thank you.
we're certainly experiencing a moment socially and culturally at the moment, and in the last, I would say, probably 5 or 7 years, where we're seeing like really high and increasing rates of transphobia within, you mentioned media and the social media and in the kind of social discourse, and looking at the situation in other countries as well, in particular in the UK and the US, we're seeing like, really high rates of all that kind of discourse. And I don't know if anybody was following the Conservative Party Congress last weekend, maybe, or earlier this week, a few days ago anyway, and all the things that they chose to speak about at that, mostly apparently being trans people, and not, in fact, the cost of living crisis or the NHS or all the other problems that they're facing over there. And so I think there's that, and I think we're really seeing an unprecedented level of focus on trans people and on trans issues that I don't think is proportionate to what's actually happening for trans people. And when we look at, let me preface this by saying there is no good data around what percentage of the population is trans, in Ireland anyway. But like, we're typically estimating like maybe 1% of the population is trans in any way. And when you look at the number of media stories that are run, the amount of conversation there is about it on social media and on Twitter or X or whatever, it is really disproportionate. And I think the concern that is there, the quote unquote concerns that are there, are not reflected in the realities for trans people. And what we're seeing as issues facing us as a community are not the issues that are being talked about. So what we're seeing as issues are, we don't have access to gender affirming care in Ireland, basically, and we have very limited access. We're seeing really high rates of like youth, like mental health risk factors for young trans people. We're seeing really high rates of self-harm and suicidality for young trans people, and none of that is what is being talked about. What is instead being talked about is all this other stuff about schools and anyway, all of it. I don't even want to give it my energy or my breath, and that's very frustrating, and it's a very difficult space to be in. And I think it's something that I have become increasingly aware of within this work, and I guess, within this work is that we as a country, I think, and as we're quite good at relating to people, and I think we've seen that, even looking at like the marriage equality referendum, what really brought that home was the idea that like we all know LGBT people and we have LGBT family members, and we're able to relate to that on like a personal level. And once you know somebody, you're able to kind of, the issues stop being this kind of amorphous cloud of problems and become like about this person that you know. And of course you would want so-and-so down the road, or your cousin or your niece or nephew or whoever, to be able to get married. And that was really effective during the marriage equality referendum. And other pieces kind of since then, and I think that works to us as a people, because we do relate to each other, and I think we have a lot of empathy, and also we're such a small country that you kind of do always know someone. But I think what we're seeing now with trans people is that, because again the proportions are much smaller and there's much fewer trans people than there are LGBT people broadly, and because what's happening in the media is very intense around that we're seeing a real focus on like individual trans people to advocate for themselves. And I see this, and this is a huge concern that I have about young trans people who are really putting themselves forward in such a wonderful and brave and honest way about their needs and what they want, but also being very vulnerable within that space. And so I think there's a piece there just around balancing knowing each other and empathizing with each other and relating to each other as people, and then also always kind of putting individual people on this sort of soapbox of having to educate us all, and just finding a balance in there, I think, around that. And I think it's kind of what I was saying earlier around just if you're having those conversations with people, like making sure that you're having them in a respectful way, and being conscious of all that too. Like, so being conscious of like, if you have someone in your family member or in the classroom or whoever it is, and you're like, oh, like that's really interesting that you're non-binary, can you tell me a bit more about that? And that's what you're saying, and maybe what they're hearing is like, it's been all the Tories have been talking about for the last week, and it's in all the news and such and such and such and such and such and such thing, and I've had 80 questions about this already this week, and I just don't want to talk about it anymore. I'm like, that's okay, like that's fine, like let's just leave some space for that too. So I think it's about just for us all being conscious of like what is in the kind of the landscape of social discourse at the moment, and how that is going to be impacting on all of the individual trans people in Ireland and that we know. So it's just about the balance piece, I think. But yeah, no, we're definitely living in extremely difficult time for trans people at the moment, and for lots of people. You know, like we're seeing the general rise of like, I think that's kind of I think it's fair to say like intolerant maybe kind of attitudes. Like it does impact on a lot of us in different ways. And if it's targeted a lot of trans people, it's targeted a lot of other groups as well at the moment. So, which is a great space
Thank
to
you.
develop solidarity. Anyway, sorry.
Well, this is true. This is true, and allies, and for people to acknowledge what's going on and to reach consensus around how we are going to support and help people, especially minorities in our wider society, but all people, so that we can understand each other and live respectfully together and learn together, learn from each other, really. Thank you very much, Daire. I really appreciate your time today and your explanations and your honesty and your passion about what is a very, very important subject. And we're going to continue this conversation at the EPALE Day in November, the National Day, which I wrote down somewhere. And that's going to be an exciting one, and we'll make sure that we circulate the day for that and that everyone can get involved. So thank you. And I think I'll just stop the recording now. So